Hi, everyone. The purpose of this webinar is to present results from a project that's currently being wrapped up related to resilience and resilient landscapes in national forest planning. And this was a project funded by the Joint Fire Science Program. You can see here the list of contributors to the project. I'm Jesse Abrams from the University of Georgia. And so what I'm going to do here is to sort of start with some definitions and talk about how resilience has appeared in recent policy direction for the U.S. Forest Service. I'm going to talk about results from three different research elements: an analysis of environmental impact statement documents, a survey sent to U.S. Forest Service staff in 2020, and then three case studies of forests who have recently revised their forest plans. I'll wrap up with some conclusions. So starting with some academic definitions, resilience is a concept that has really surged in the literature, particularly the environmental management literature, since the 1970s. And I would say there's a lot we could say about this concept. At the heart of it, I think it's really core value is that it's an alternative to the kinds of paradigms that were dominant for much of the 20th century. And those paradigms tended to see systems as inherently at a kind of a steady state, at kind of an equilibrium. And so disturbances and perturbations and change were seen as kind of unwelcome outsiders on the system. And so that was reflected in our environmental management as well, in the sense that we often tried to eliminate disturbances, variability, and these sorts of surprises. And so the classic example, of course, being something like fire suppression. Our paradigm for much of the 20th century said that we would get more of the things we wanted from the forest if we got rid of fire. And of course, we all know now that practice had some consequences that we're now seeing were not only not successful, but created so much bigger problems. And so resilience, I think one of its contributions as a concept is that it says disturbances, change, dynamics, these are all part of systems, social systems and ecological systems. And so the question then becomes, how do we live constructively with change, with disturbance, rather than trying to eliminate it? I think another key insight of the resilience concept in the resilience literature is this notion of threshold effects and nonlinear and irreversible change. The idea here being that not all change is a linear response to some pressure. At some point, we may see very little change over a certain range of pressure or disturbance, and then at some point the system flips into another state, and when it does so, it may be very difficult to bring it back to its prior state. So some other, I think, important elements of the academic literature around the concept of resilience is that ecological and social systems increasingly are seen as being linked rather than two separate spheres. And so this, as I'll get into in a moment, there are a lot of different definitions of resilience. One of the important ones in the literature is social ecological system resilience, and that's very much associated with this concept. From a managerial standpoint, the implication is that managers should be flexible, adaptable, and experimental rather than attempting to predict, control, and stabilize. And so this obviously fits very well with the concept of adaptive management, the idea of seeing management as an experiment, sort of constantly monitoring and learning to improve as we go forward. And I would say that the resilience literature has also emphasize the idea that we need to always specify when we talk about resilience of what, to what, and for whom. And so the three parts of this phrase specify that we want to specify the system to which we're measuring resilience. So what are we talking about? What is the system at play here? To what? So what is the disturbance or pressure or change agent to which that system may or may not be resilient? And who decides? Inevitably, there are always going to be value judgments involved in defining what are the things in the system that we care about, that we want to see retained. And so there's some aspects that have to do with how we include people in those decision-making processes for defining what it is that we care about and what it is that we want to see continue to be resilient. So as I mentioned, there are a lot of different academic definitions in this field. I'll walk through some of the most important ones. First is this notion of resistance, which is the ability to absorb a disturbance without changing. And so resistance is different from resilience, as you'll see in a moment. So there are several different resilience definitions. The one that's most like resistance is engineering resilience. And that's the idea that we're measuring the speed and ease with which a system returns to its equilibrium state following some kind of disturbance. So this is sometimes called bounce back resilience. Resistance, the idea behind resistance is the system doesn't change at all. The idea behind engineering resilience is that the system changes, but then goes right back to where it was before. That's different from what C.S. Halling, who's really kind of considered the originator of our sort of contemporary conception of resilience. He called ecological resilience, and you can see Walker and some of their colleagues sort of provided a further refinement of this definition. They define it as the capacity of a system to absorb disturbance and reorganize while undergoing change so as to still retain essentially the same function, structure, identity, and feedbacks. So the idea here being, it's not that the system goes right back to where it was before after a disturbance. It's that it essentially continues to adapt while retaining some core elements that give it its identity and function. And so this is sometimes called bounce forward resilience rather than bounce back, as is represented by engineering resilience. The concept of social ecological resilience is very similar to ecological resilience, but it is applied to a coupled social ecological system. So you can see here the capacity of an integrated social ecological system to constructively incorporate and deal with disturbance in ways that do not lead to drastic social consequences. And so that last part of the phrase there, that last part of the definition, speaks to the idea of resilience for whom. At some point we have to define what does it mean to have drastic social consequences? What are the elements of the system that are valued by people that we want to maintain? And then finally, there's this concept of transformation, which is distinct from these definitions of resistance and resilience by saying this is really a measure of how well we can move from one state to another if the old state is not sustainable, if it's not desirable. I think that there's a kind of a longer conversation here, but people have often stressed, people that are working in this field have often stressed, just because something is resilient doesn't mean that it's good, right? So an example might be a cheatgrass system. It can be quite resilient in the sense that you can burn it, you can treat it in all kinds of ways, and it often comes back to the way it was before. And so transformation says, well, what if we don't like the system the way it is now? We want to move it to another system, another kind of set of feedbacks and identities. And so that's what transformation is about. So the Forest Service has its own definition of resilience. You can see it here, the ability of an ecosystem and its component parts to absorb or recover from the effects of disturbances through preservation, restoration, or improvement of its essential structures and functions, and redundancy of ecological patterns across the landscape. So very much taking inspiration from that ecological definition of resilience. Resilience is also talked about quite a bit in the National Cohesive Wildfire Strategy. You can see here it says landscape resiliency has been defined in various ways, but at its core are sustainability and resistance to and recovery from disturbance. But they say we need to recognize that discussions about sustaining values and resiliency are contextual. That is, they vary from location to location and depend upon a host of local considerations, including both ecological and human dimensions. So again, really driving home that idea of being specific about resilience of what, to what, and for whom. I'm not going to go into great detail here other than say that this sort of focus on resilience and resilient landscapes, particularly in the context of climate change, has shown up in a lot of sort of U.S. Forest Service specific policies in recent years. In the Forest Service Manual, again, cohesive strategy, the 2012 planning rule, under NIFMA, which ultimately did not incorporate a lot of resilience language, but it is there in some of the definitions and in the preamble, and very much is related to some of these other concepts like ecological integrity and adaptation to climate change. The roadmap and scorecard released in 2011, as well as the strategic framework of 2008. So the point here being that this is not just an academic concept, although it is an academic concept as well, but it's increasingly showing up in policy and practice related to forest management. So with that in mind, the objectives of this research were to synthesize across document analysis, survey, and case study elements to determine how resilience concepts have been operationalized and to identify sort of practical challenges and solutions to meeting those resilient landscape outcomes. So the methods here I'll describe briefly. As I said, I'm going to be talking about results from 3 different research elements. The first was a content analysis of environmental impact statements between 2007 and 2016. We essentially found a total of about 327. Again, these are EISs written by the U.S. Forest Service. We found about 327 that we were able to download the full EIS from the web. And then we did a more intensive analysis of 94 of those documents. And the criteria, one of the criteria for choosing those was that they used some resilience terminology like the word resilient or resiliency, a minimum number of 5 times within the document. And the idea here being we wanted to see when managers and planners are using these terms, what do they mean? And so we did some content analysis on those documents. We also conducted a survey of Forest Service staff in 2020. We sent out a little over 2,000 email recruitment emails, and we got 428 usable, complete responses to the survey, which gives us a response rate of a little over 19%. Not a great number, but pretty typical for internet survey research these days. And then we conducted 3 case studies. Again, these were national forests that had recently undergone their forest plan revision. And so the 3 forests we chose were the Kaibab National Forest in northern Arizona, the Francis Marion National Forest in South Carolina, and the Rio Grande National Forest in southern Colorado. And so these included interviews with key stakeholders, both inside and outside the agency in each case at the forest and regional levels. We also obviously looked at documents, including the plans themselves, EISs, et cetera. Now I should say that of these 3 forests, the Kaibab revised their plan under the 1982 NIFMA rule, whereas the Francis Marion and the Rio Grande National Forest revised under the 2012 rule. But the Kaibab planning staff said they were very much, even though they used the 82 rule, they were inspired by and incorporated concepts from the newer rule related to things like climate change and resilience. And so this was still a very relevant plan revision to study. So starting with the EIS analysis, we, of the 94 EISs for which we did a deep dive, only 28 of them specifically defined resilience. So in other words, all 94 of these were using resilience terminology, but only 28 of them included a specific definition. Of those definitions, 15 of them were what you would call engineering resilience, so meaning bounce back to a previous state, versus about 13 that were ecological or social ecological system definitions. And so most of those in the latter category used the official U.S. Forest Service definition that I showed a moment ago. We also looked in these EISs to see to what extent did they talk about some of these sort of historical or larger contextual factors outside the sort of the scope of the plan itself, of whatever project was being planned. And interestingly, over 90% of these EISs at some point alluded to or specifically addressed the history of altering past fire regimes. And quite a large majority as well discussed or alluded to climate change at some point. A smaller number referenced a history of altering other disturbances, such as, let's say, diseases or insect outbreaks. But still, I think this is an interesting sign that some of these past or larger scale kind of contextual influences on resilience are being included in these EISs. One of the questions we asked when coding and analyzing these EISs was we wanted to know what sorts of disturbance agents were being included when it comes to resilience. So this goes back to that question of resilience to what? And so you can see here the different categories we looked for. Probably not surprising here that the big three disturbance agents that were talked about in the context of resilience were wildfire, native insects, and native diseases. But we did see at least a few EISs treating some of these other disturbance agents as well in the context of resilience. A second question we asked once we found these patterns was to say, when a particular disturbance agent is treated in an EIS, when it's discussed, is it discussed purely as a negative influence on the system, or is there some acknowledgement that it could have beneficial effects? And so that's what this chart shows, is when each of these disturbances is discussed in an EIS, is there some indication that it could actually play a beneficial role in some way, whether it's to the system as a whole or a particular wildlife or plant species? And so, interestingly here, wildfire, when it's talked about, is almost always acknowledged that it has some potentially beneficial effects, as well as a majority of the time that native insects, native diseases, flooding, and wind are discussed. So these are all good signs that the conceptualization of disturbance has moved away from seeing it as purely a negative influence to at least acknowledging the possibility that it could have some positive influences. So next I'm going to talk about survey results. One of the questions we asked here was, we asked respondents, again, these are Forest Service staff who have worked on some kind of planning in recent years. We asked them what they think the scientific definition of resilience is and what they think the U.S. Forest Service definition of resilience is. And so you can see there are these different options across the bottom, and they essentially correspond to some of the categories that I talked about earlier. So the first one, resist or withstand external disturbances, that obviously corresponds to resistance. Quickly return to a pre-disturbance state following disturbances, that's your engineering resilience. Adapt to disturbances while retaining core system components, that's ecological or social ecological system resilience. And then undergo complete system changes in response to disturbances, which corresponds with transformation or transformability. And so the pattern here, you can see that the light green corresponds to what people felt was the correct scientific definition. The dark green corresponds to what they felt was the U.S. Forest Service's definition. So you can see that a majority felt that kind of ecological or social ecological system resilience was the right scientific definition, but less than a majority felt that that was the definition that the Forest Service was using. And so they pointed to those engineering resilience and resistance as the more common definitions used by the Forest Service. We also asked respondents to tell us how clear they thought the term was, and again, in terms of both its scientific meaning and in terms of its meaning within national forest policy. And so the pattern here, probably not surprising based on the last slide, a majority felt that the term was clear in terms of its scientific meaning, but a much smaller number felt that it was clear in terms of its policy meaning for national forests, with a larger proportion, a kind of a slim majority, disagreeing or strongly disagreeing that the term was clear for forest policy. So this slide and the next slide have a lot of information on them. I'll sort of walk you through it, make sense of what looks like a lot of data. We asked a series of questions where we posed different policies or practices, and we asked respondents to tell us, do you think this policy or practice helps to enable your ability to manage for resilient landscapes? Does it constrain your ability to manage for resilient landscapes? Or is it neither constraining nor enabling? And so on these charts, the dark blue and blue correspond to greatly constrain and constrain the ability to manage for resilient landscapes. The light green and dark green correspond to enable and greatly enable your ability to manage for resilient landscapes. And then the yellow is in the middle, neither constrains nor enables. And so these different policies and practices are listed in descending order of how much they were ranked as a constraint. So in other words, the policies and practices at the top of this list are the ones that were seen as, by the largest number of respondents, as constraining the ability to manage for resilient landscapes. And those, as you go further down, are less widely seen to constrain. So on this list, the first two sort of practices or issues that were seen overwhelmingly by respondents as constraining the ability to manage for resilience had to do with budgets, implementation budgets, and planning budgets for the agency. Next, you have a couple of sort of factors having to do with the public and sort of outside pressure on the agency. So public pressure, the full wording of that was public pressure to avoid ground disturbing activities. You have appeals, lawsuits, et cetera, seen as a constraint on the ability to manage for resilient landscapes. Then following that, timber targets. So the agency's targets for the amount of timber they are expected to produce in a year. Science limitations, obviously seen as a fairly large constraint for the agency, just not having the right science to manage for resilience. It isn't until we get past that we get to our first true policy, which is the Endangered Species Act. But even in that case, less than half felt that it was a constraint or a great constraint on their ability to manage for resilient landscape outcomes. Then you have the sort of the pressure to bulletproof NEPA, so in other words, to make it immune from objections, appeals, and lawsuits. Hazardous fuels targets were seen more or less evenly as a constraint and an enabler to managing for resilient landscapes, and same thing with NEPA, with the National Environmental Policy Act. So interestingly here, some of the formal policies were not seen as high of a constraint as some of these other issues, such as, again, budgets and public pressure. This next slide continues the same pattern, but in this case, these are all factors where they were seen as more enabling than constraining. And so the process of expediting the NEPA process, collaboration in general, the National Forest Management Act, and then collaborating with non-Forest Service scientific partners, obviously all seen as enabling more than they constrain. Then you have a series of recent policies and sort of policy documents. So stewardship contracting, collaborative forest landscape restoration program, the Joint Chiefs Landscape Restoration Program, the Healthy Forest Restoration Act, and the Cohesive Strategy. All of those seen as, on the whole, enabling much more than they constrain the ability to manage for resilient outcomes. And then finally, partnering with scientists within the Forest Service. So some interesting patterns here. Again, particularly with regards to the effect of policies versus some of these other factors on the ability to manage for resilient landscape outcomes. And so here's just sort of a summary, because I know that was a lot of information. So the big constraints: budget limitations, public scrutiny and pressure, timber targets, and science gaps. The major enablers of the ability to manage for resilient landscapes: partnering with scientists both inside and outside the agency, collaboration generally, and those recent policies and programs that I mentioned. We also asked respondents in the survey to tell us where they felt the priorities were being placed in terms of these four different options. Meeting flagship targets, so again, those would be your acres of timber sold and, board feet of timber sold and acres treated for hazardous fuels. Managing for resilient landscapes is a second option. Third is crafting simple and effective NEPA documents. And then fourth, incorporating climate science into analysis and planning. We asked people to answer this question in terms of what they felt the priorities were at the forest level, at the regional level, and at the Washington level. And so I'll show all three of those. This first one is from the forest level. As you can see, almost everyone agrees that the priority is on meeting those flagship targets. A majority, but a smaller majority, felt that the priority was on managing for resilient landscapes and kind of making NEPA simpler and easier. with a small minority feeling that incorporating climate science was prioritized at the forest level. The pattern is relatively similar at the regional level. Flagship targets are kind of blooming large there. Smaller proportion feeling that resilient landscapes were a priority, and a slightly higher number feeling that the NEPA, expediting NEPA and incorporating climate science were prioritized. And then again, kind of continuing the pattern at the Washington level, flagship targets number one, and even lower emphasis on resilience, and the numbers are relatively unchanged for the other two categories. So finally, I'm going to get to the case study results here. I'm going to show a couple of examples of how resilience was incorporated in these forest plans. So this comes from the desired conditions on the Francis Marion National Forest from their recent plan revision. And so they said, to increase resiliency to climate change, the forest is healthy, free of excessive insect and disease pressure, and tree densities are moderate. Longleaf pine is favored over loblolly pine in the upland longleaf pine forest and wet pine savanna ecosystems. Refuge conditions are promoted to the extent feasible for climate-sensitive species. Bottomland hardwoods and native grasses and forbs within fire-adapted, low-density forest and grasslands are desired. So pretty specific guidance here regarding how resilience was to be kind of conceptualized in some of these systems, particularly looking at this issue of favoring longleaf pine over loblolly, which, loblolly was planted pretty extensively in the past, particularly following Hurricane Hugo. So this kind of shows, I think, a forward-looking sort of conceptualization of resilience that takes into account things like climate change and sea level rise. On the Kaibab National Forest, they included this climate change approach as an appendix to the forest plan. And so I'll read this along with you, that although current programs and guidance are already in place to limit introduction of non-native species, treat invasive species, and control insects and diseases, these efforts are likely to become more critical to maintaining desired conditions for healthy forests under a changing climate. In addition, management practices such as prescribed selection of cutting for age class diversity that sustain healthy forests and provide adequate nutrient, soil productivity, and hydrologic function promote resilience and reduce the potential for disturbance and damage. So again, quite a sort of specific kind of ecologically informed definition of resilience that takes climate change into account. You can see here on the Rio Grande, maintain and restore sustainable, resilient terrestrial ecosystems. This was a goal one from their plan. Ecosystems are a barometer of the quality of land management practices. A natural variety of species, genetic composition, and ecological processes are key to providing the diversity needed for resiliency in the face of environmental disturbances and changes. So a little bit more of a 30,000-foot view of resilience here without getting into the specifics. So in terms of our case studies, the challenges to managing for resilient landscapes that we found from kind of across our three cases, probably not surprising to say that definitional issues were a concern. And in this case, particularly when you get to this question of frequent fire versus infrequent fire systems, I think it's fair to say that the meaning of resilience, what it would take to achieve resilience, and the agreement on those terms was relatively strong in frequent fire systems. So there tends to be pretty broad agreement and a lot of clarity around what resilience means. And ponderosa pine, for example, dry mix conifer, longleaf pine systems. In the infrequent fire systems, such as the high elevation spruce fir that is dominant on the Rio Grande National Forest, it was harder for people to come to a clear agreement on what resilience might mean. On the Rio Grande, just around the time that the plan was being revised, they'd had a very intense spruce beetle outbreak that killed most of the mature spruce on the forest. And so it kind of led to some conversations about what does resilience mean in the context of a system like this that tends to not have a lot of sort of standard placing disturbance, but then has an event like this every several centuries. Definitionally, this question of the tensions between restoration and managing for resilience also came up. So that this question of how much does the natural range of variability apply when you are thinking about climate change, climate-driven changes in things like the distribution of plant communities. So sort of another challenge here that came up in certain cases. In this case, that was particularly on the kaibab. So we talked about adaptive management, the idea of being flexible and adaptable. I think it was pretty widely recognized in all of our cases that for managers to be adaptable, they need to have trust. They need to have that kind of trust from their local and regional networks and stakeholders. And that once you lose that trust, and if you lose that trust, it can be very hard to get it back, and you can kind of get locked in a cycle of every movement, every decision being challenged, every decision being scrutinized. That can make it tough to really be adaptable, to be flexible, to learn from mistakes, et cetera. Some other challenges, I think kind of at an institutional level, a lot of people that we spoke with referenced this tension between those annual performance measures. Again, those are those performance metrics like board feet of timber sold and acres treated for hazardous fuels. The tension between those and managing for long-term resilience. Now, that's not to say that it's always going to be a trade-off between those two. For example, there may be cases in which you're able to meet timber targets, meet acres treated targets, while also managing for long-term resilience. But I think a lot of people recognize that they're not always in sync. There may be times in which one takes precedence over the other. Monitoring was widely recognized to be underfunded and underprioritized, which is a problem when thinking about this whole notion of adaptive management, learning from management, completing that adaptive cycle. And then there were some broader capacity constraints. So just the acknowledgement that the agency has lost staffing, that more and more of the funding is going towards fire suppression. And so managing for resilience and resilient landscapes is a big sort of objective, and it takes a lot of resources to do so. And so there are questions about how the agency was going to take on this task, given that their capacity continues to shrink. So some of the kind of best practices for meeting these challenges that came out of our case studies. A big one was, maybe stating the obvious here, but improved fire planning. So the forest took advantage of the plan revision process to rethink their approach to fire management, and in some cases to really simplify the way that they plan for fire. And so examples here, I'll show an image here in a moment, but an example here on the Francis Marion, they went to a very simple 2-zone designation where they said management area 1 is for places where we feel like we can use fire aggressively, put a lot of prescribed fire on the ground. And management area 2 is places closer to homes and infrastructure and roads where we're probably not going to be using fire that much. And just that kind of very simply dividing the landscape up that way, I think was seen as a big help in sort of implementing an aggressive fire program. Both the Rio Grande and the kaibab included greater flexibility for using fire for resource benefits in their forest plan revisions. And immediately on the kaibab, they were able to put that into use. A big focus on partnering with others on prescribed fire implementation. Some of these details aren't necessarily written into the forest plan, but as far as looking at what the agency is able to do and setting targets, I think the idea of partnering with states, partnering with organizations like the Nature Conservancy, this is now a pretty kind of standard part of moving forward for a lot of these forests and helping to fill in some of those capacity gaps that I mentioned. So this is just an image of that the 2 management area sort of approach on the Francis Marion National Forest. And so you can see the green here is your management area 1, further away from communities and infrastructure. The plan here is to use prescribed fire pretty aggressively. Management area 2 in the blue is closer to homes, infrastructure, et cetera, and probably, well, at least for now, less fire use, but as conditions change, there may be opportunities to expand management area 1. So some other best practices, a big focus on increased science support and partnerships. All of these forests that we studied worked with universities, Forest Service research stations, NGOs, et cetera, to fill in some of the science gaps that we mentioned. Many of them included the analyses and data and modeling directly into the plan. Improved relationships and partnerships with tribes. This was a huge issue for a lot of reasons, for supporting monitoring, for bringing the sort of traditional knowledge into planning and management. I think the KIBAB was really a standout in this case. And then there was at least some discussion, and still remains to be seen how well it's put into practice, of building a kind of a citizen science network. So building upon these local partners and groups and people who are interested in the forest to bring them into the process of monitoring, as well as to use other resources for monitoring, including things like already existing data, FIA data, for example. So I'll wrap up with a few conclusions here. I think one of the sort of thinking across the three research elements, one of the sort of standout take-home points is that we need to be very clear when we're defining resilience. What do we actually mean? So this is something that came out in the EIS analysis. It certainly came out in the survey. So be clear about, are we talking about resistance? Are we talking about engineering resilience? Are we talking about an ecological definition of resilience, a social ecological definition, or are we talking about transformation? We didn't see much discussion of transformation in the EISs or in the forest plans, but it is also, I think, an important concept to include here. Again, on the definitional issue, what does resilience mean in some of these different systems? What does it mean in a frequent fire versus an infrequent fire system? And how do we know what sorts of scientific information is available? Again, I think we're seeing forests really taking advantage of a lot of different partnerships, a lot of different data sources for filling in some of the science gaps. On the definitional issue, how useful is natural range of variability? To what extent are we going to have to talk about trade-offs between restoration and resilience? These are all questions that will have to be answered on a case-by-case basis. How will the forest monitor and adjust over time? I think the forests that we looked at in our case studies had some ideas, some had some pretty concrete plans, but there was, I'd say, widespread concern among many of our interviewees that this was a missing piece. This was something that was not given the resources that it deserves. And in terms of managing for resilience, I think some relevant questions are how much trust has been built with relevant publics. This is obviously key to that adaptability we talked about. Is there agreement among those publics on what resilience means? Is there agreement on definitional issues, on science issues? And then in what ways can partnerships help to leverage capacity? We talked about those. And then this notion of tensions between long-term resilience and short-term performance metrics. You know, all these are questions that I think each management unit will have to answer. You know, I think what this research did is to sort of highlight what some of these challenges are. Certainly there's some, as I mentioned, some solutions, some best practices that came out of our case studies, but I think the unique nature of each individual district and forest will mean that the answers to these questions will vary and the solutions are going to vary. So a few conclusions. I think it's fair to say that there's a lot of potential still to improve the integration of resilience and resilience concepts into forest planning and management. The challenges that we found really had to do with that lack of definitional clarity, some concerns about capacity gaps, both in terms of staffing, but also in terms of resources for monitoring. And then this notion of conflicts with quantitative targets. Again, it's not saying that there's always going to be a conflict between quantitative targets and resilience, but there may be in some cases. And so the big opportunities here really lie in partnerships and building these trust relationships and networks that can kind of simultaneously help to build greater flexibility, maybe fill in for some of those capacity gaps, and generally kind of build trust going forward. There are already a couple of resources available on the web through the Ecosystem Workforce Program. You can go ahead and download these for free at any time. These are working papers that have already been published. There will be additional working papers and other publications coming out soon that will also be on the website. And so I want to thank you all for your attention to this presentation. I want to thank the Southwest Fire Science Consortium for hosting, the Northwest Fire Science Consortium for co-hosting, and of course the Joint Fire Science Program for funding this research. And I welcome anyone to contact me with any questions or follow up. So thanks much.